I'm pleased to be joined for most of the show today by our friend Kris Sims. Kris is the Alberta Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Hi, Kris. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Good morning, Candice. Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to just take a minute to plug a new piece of work that we have done over at Juno News. So if you head on over to Juno News, you will see that we have done a deep dive. We've done our own bit of investigative journalism into the new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. We have a clip of that documentary that I would like to play for you now. How well do we know Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney? Pretty well, right? He's the high-profile former governor of the Bank of Canada, who then jet-setted across the pond to become the first ever Canadian-born governor of the Bank of England. He's a mainstay in global power circles, serving a leadership role in the World Economic Forum, acting as the special envoy for climate change and finance at the United Nations, sitting on the board of a number of nonprofits promoting the net zero approach and the urgent need for climate change, and he's a wealthy and successful banker. Until recently, he was the chairman of one of Canada's largest companies, Brookfield Asset Management, which describes itself as a leading global investment firm with over $1 trillion in assets under management. So very excited to be releasing that. We went through many of the claims that Mark Carney has made that he has been contradicted on. And frankly, Kris, we did the job that the legacy media refuses to do, which is just dig into it, dig into the claims, try to figure out what the truth is when it comes to the things that we're told about Mark Carney. I mean, we've been told so many things that have just turned out not to be true. So we spent a bunch of time and effort putting that together. And if you'd like to see the entire documentary, please head on over to junonews.com. It is available at this point exclusively to our subscribers. And we think it's incredibly important that Canadians get this message. So as everybody saw on Sunday night, Mark Carney was selected as leader of the Liberal Party, which means that he will succeed Justin Trudeau and become our next prime minister. We still don't even know when he's going to be signed in. So at this point, he is just the prime minister designate. But I want to talk a little bit about that leadership vote on Sunday night, Kris, because there were a couple of things that just doesn't really add up to me when it comes to what happened. And so first I want to let's just do a comparison between the Liberals and the Conservatives. So first thing, we were told that the convention that the Liberals held on Sunday evening in Ottawa had fewer than 2,000 people in attendance. Compare that to Pierre Poilievre, who did a rally in London, Ontario, a much smaller city, and this is just a rally, and there were an estimated 2,500 attendees. This is according to Juno News. And so just even the idea that they are selecting a new leader for the Liberal Party, and there are fewer people than just go to like your run-of-the-mill Pierre Poilievre rally that's not even during a campaign. You had two former prime ministers in attendance in Ottawa, and they couldn't even pull out a crowd of more than 2,000 people. And then when it comes to the number of people who voted, so we had been told that there were 400,000 registered Liberals that were going to be voting in this race. And remember that in order to be a Liberal member, you don't have to pay any money. Unlike in the Conservative Party, you do have to pay. For the Liberals, you don't even have to be a citizen of Canada, which to me is just so outrageous. And you can they open membership to anybody over the age of 14. So you could have a 14-year-old who is a foreign national and not a Canadian, who didn't pay any money, has nothing invested, and you could go ahead and you could vote. So we were told that was 400,000, and yet the party said that 151,000 people voted in the race.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, they said that 163,000 people successfully went through the authentication process. So out of 400,000, only 163, it seems, could be confirmed to be real people. And of those, only 151% voted. So the Liberals are running around today saying that 93% of their party voted in this race, but only if you take that smaller number. And 163,000 people, I mean, that seems kind of like a lot, But in the world of politics, I mean, that is significantly smaller than the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party had 417,000 people vote in their leadership race. I mean, 160,000 people, that's fewer than the number of people who receive emails from me, like on my email list. And I'm sure it's the same with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Not a very large percentage of Canadians. And so we're told, sure, Mark Carney got 85%, I believe, of the vote. But again, that's of that smaller number. This isn't any kind of a resounding mandate from Canadians. And it raises so many questions, Kris, about the authenticity or the how secure this process is if 400,000 people were on the list and only 150,000 of them actually voted. What happened to the others and why weren't their votes counted? What do you make of all this?
Well, it's a great question, Candice. And I saw some of the voter breakdowns. I'll get to that in a second on regionalism and where they were voting from. I thought that was pretty interesting. But you're right. I did find it a really small number of people. Like, for example, the Taxpayers Federation, when we send out a survey or something to our supporters, it goes to around 250,000 people. And that's just one advocacy group. So that's not including Fraser Institute or any other group. That's just the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And so to have that small group of Canadians had now selected the prime minister designate, he hasn't been sworn in yet, is really quite eye-opening. I found it interesting on where these folks apparently were voting from. And so apparently they were voting largely from, say, downtown Toronto, downtown Ottawa, really kind of hyper urban places, but not the more what you would call kind of the working class, middle income, newer Canadian areas. So, for example, my uncle actually works in London as a security guard near the soup kitchen there, which unfortunately, by the way, is getting flooded with people. Record numbers of people are going to the food bank and the soup kitchen there. He sees it there every day. Lots of people struggling. Down the street is where that Pierre Poilievre rally was being held. So I found that very interesting that I was hearing numbers everywhere between 2,500 and 3,000 people at the Pierre Poilievre rally. Yet in downtown Ottawa, where they're selecting a new prime minister of Canada, kind of a big deal for that
Yeah.
party. Regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, if that's your party, that seems like a pretty big deal. And they were able to only pull in a smaller crowd. And it was a smaller crowd, even apparently according to the CBC, saying this is a smaller crowd. So I found it really telling that the issues of affordability and people just being broke mattered more if you take a look at the tea leaves and the data sets than the glitz and glamour that was going on in Ottawa.
Well, it's just it's so remarkable. You know, you think that the Liberal Party, they have been in power for the last 9 years. Like you said, they're selecting their new prime minister. They had Jean Chrétien, they had Justin Trudeau, they had kind of like a stellar lineup. If you're a Liberal and you're excited, like imagine if there was an event that had Stephen Harper speaking, that had Pierre Poilievre speaking, like had all the big players in the Conservative movement.
Hmm.
I'm telling you, there'd be tens of thousands of people in attendance for that. And again, I just find it really worrying and concerning that so many people who had signed up to vote in the Liberal leadership race didn't get to vote. And I'll tell you, Kris, like my inbox was filled with concerned Liberals who had been turned away. I received many of these sort of tips of people who had registered, who
Hmm.
are Liberals, who wanted to vote, and some kind of trivial discrepancy meant that they were blocked. Like one, an example would be like if you go by Dan, but your name's Daniel, and so when you registered, you wrote Dan, but then the ID that you tried to produce said Daniel, and they just wouldn't let you vote. And
Wow.
when that happens on scale, I
Yeah.
mean, we had the Globe and Mail pointing out that only 40% of the registered Liberals voted, which means that 60% were rejected. I mean, how can you walk around and say that Mark Carney has this huge mandate, even from within the Liberal Party, when 60% of the people who wanted to vote were somehow found to be illegitimate and not able to vote? To me, that is so suspicious and it's so alarming. I hope that someone is able to uncover. We're talking about a whistleblower later in the show who has done some undercover journalism to expose flaws in the Ontario voting system. But I would really like to see what is happening with the Liberals, because that is a huge percentage of people who were unable to vote. And again, just for context, because we keep hearing that 85% of Liberals voted for Mark Carney and only 62% of Conservatives voted for Pierre Poilievre back in 2022 when he became leader. And yet everybody said that Pierre Poilievre had like a resounding victory. But if you just look at the numbers, 132,000 people voted for Mark Carney, whereas 295,000 voted for Pierre Poilievre. And so more Canadians, twice as many Canadians, in fact, cast their vote in a leadership race for Pierre Poilievre. And I have a hard time really believing that Mark Carney has any kind of a mandate. I want to just stay with the Sunday night event, because there was a couple of things that were really kind of resounding to me. One of it was that Mark Carney pledged that he would get rid of the capital gains tax and get rid of the carbon tax. So I imagine you folks over at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation were giving yourselves a little pat on the back, because you were the ones that were really leading the campaign against these disastrous taxes. And so the fact that both parties kind of are in agreement about that is good. One thing that I really noted was that when Mark Carney announced to the Liberal audience that he was getting rid of carbon tax, the place like erupted in cheers. And it just seems so ironic to me that like the Liberals, who for the last 10 years have been pushing this green agenda, saying that the planet is on fire and that we have to tax ourselves and shut down our industry in order to save the planet. And the key policy of Prime Minister Trudeau had been this carbon tax, which was also championed and demanded for by Mark Carney in the background. And here you had the entire Liberal convention applauding, like erupting in cheers over the fact that they were getting rid of it. So, well, from a taxpayer's perspective, what do you think of all that?
So many points there. Very briefly, just touching back on the issue between mandates. I will point out that Pierre Poilievre has been a member of parliament since he was in his early to mid 20s, and he was then the opposition leader. However, with Mark Carney, this is the first time that someone with zero Parliament Hill experience, so has not been a member of parliament, has not been a senator, has not been a cabinet minister, is now going to be catapulted directly. Do not pass go, do not pass, collect $200, all the way into the seat of the PMO. So yes, John Turner had taken a turn out of parliament and then he was put back in. There are a few earlier prime ministers that kind of fall under that, but they had been senators before, or they had been cabinet ministers before, or even prime ministers previously before they became prime minister again. This is the first time that somebody, off the street, so to speak, is now becoming prime minister. And so I think that is why there's more scrutiny from across the board. It's been mainstream media and independent media going, this is pretty interesting. So I think it's the severity, the level of power that is giving more scrutiny to this mandate, whether or not he has one. To the issue of the carbon tax, we were happy to hear Mark Carney say he's going to scrap the carbon tax, but he said that, this is the catch, he said that in a leak through his leadership team early on. And that soaked up all the headlines. It was like that ShamWow commercial with the blanket. It just sucked up all the headlines. Mark Carney, ding dong, the witch is dead. They're getting rid of the carbon tax. But then the devil's in the details. Then he made his announcement in Halifax and said he's going to immediately remove the consumer carbon tax. So what does that mean? And then later on in Kelowna, he changed it again. And he said he's not going to axe the tax. The crowd laughed at that idea, which really got my dander up, Candice. And then he said he's going to change the carbon tax. So face value, at least the one thing Carney should do right now, like today, is tell the cabinet ministers, hey, put in a request through, order in council, get rid of the carbon tax now. And they can do that without parliament sitting. They can change the amount collected by the carbon tax in their orders to zero. So that's the very least he can do now, because right now Canadians are still paying this thing and it's set to go up April 1st. To give you an idea, the average, not a huge mansion with an indoor swimming pool and 3 big personal cars, the way Trudeau used to say, the average Alberta household is going to be out $440 this year just for heating their home. So Carney should do the right thing today, Candice, and make that carbon tax rate go down to zero. That's for now. But you're right. He's been in the background pushing for carbon taxes basically his entire professional life, his entire political career. Like, it's all through this book. I know that your folks there at Juno and True North, did a lot of work on this. I know Cosman did a big deep dive on this. It's the keystone to his worldview. Carbon taxes are a keystone to Mark Carney's worldview. So for him to turn away from it is like a vegan suddenly eating steak. That is a big deal. So we're going to take him at his word right now and push him to get rid of the consumer carbon tax, so at least it's off of everybody's heat bills and off the price at the pump between now and April 1st. Then we're going to see what's going to happen during the election.
Well, I would say it's not quite like a vegan eating steak because he hasn't actually eaten it yet. It's like a vegan ordering steak, and it's yet to be seen whether or not they'll actually eat it because
Great point.
I mean, it's like yeah, everything that he believes, everything that he's built his career upon, this whole net zero approach that has been devastating in the UK, and you now have UK officials coming out saying, Canada, be careful with this guy. He was a disaster in the UK. Former Prime Minister Liz Truss said that. Financial columnist Matthew Liu also had a column saying the same thing. Yeah, he's going to get rid of the consumer facing one, but the devil's in the details. And just the fact that the liberal audience was cheering over that, I think it's really just all about crass politics because Mark Carney is just a continuation of Justin Trudeau. Like what we've seen is kind of a remarkable bait and switch. Justin Trudeau, greatly unpopular, tanked in popularity, has done so much damage to the Canadian economy, to Canadian unity, to our sense of country, to our safety. Just the list goes on and on. He's unpopular, so he taps his economic advisor to come out and take over. And he admits so much. So Mark Carney was in Parliament yesterday talking to the reporters for the first time. He said that he just finished a meeting with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and that the transition will be seamless and quick. Of course it is, because they have the same views, they have the same position, they have the same staff, right? It's literally
Yes.
just a switch. Let's play Mark Carney in his own words admitting all of this.
Just had a long meeting with the Prime Minister. We discussed the most important issues for our country, obviously including Canada and U.S. relations, issues of national security, and yes, the transition between the Prime Minister and myself. That transition will be seamless and it will be quick.
He was even kind of smirking about that. Like, of course it'll be quick and seamless because it's the same thing.
Yes.
What do you think?
Yes, so parties have not changed. Power hasn't really changed. This is just a transition from one party leader within the Liberals to the other party leader. I can't help but kind of smile because I've worked on Parliament Hill. I worked there for probably around 20 years, give or take. And to see Mark Carney there standing in the foyer, I'm wondering if Dominic LeBlanc was his MP buddy that helped him through security and got the wand and everything, just like somebody would if you're taking a tour of the building. Because again, he is not a member of Parliament. But in this, we have an interesting system in the Westminster system. Technically, you don't need to be a member of Parliament to be a member of Cabinet. And the Prime Minister is the first Cabinet Minister chosen by and accepted by the Crown. So this is up to King Charles III and through his representative, Mary Simon, the Governor General, to then swear him in to Cabinet and have him be the Prime Minister. I found it really interesting that there's this strange kind of Jekyll and Hyde approach to him being changey and new. Meanwhile, everybody who's followed politics knows that he's been right in there advising these folks. In fact, folks might remember just before this dust up started, when Chrystia Freeland, the narrative goes, says she didn't want to run a 60-something billion dollar deficit. She only wanted to run a $40 billion deficit. Who was going to replace her? Mark Carney. Like, everybody on the Hill knew that he was going to be the person to replace her as finance minister once outgoing Trudeau prime minister was getting rid of her. So to have it now being played as if he's the new guy, but he's also the old guy, it's kind of mind-bending. What really gets me is, again, he's on the record so many times, Candice. This wasn't just a one-off comment that somebody said at a party or a bar or something. Like, he has written, like, literally a book on this stuff. He got his undergrad at Harvard. He got his PhD at Oxford. He takes a global view to this stuff. Like, on the front of his book, it's literally the planet with scaffolding around it. Like, he's going to fix the whole of the earth for us. What got me, Candice, is that throughout this book, he talks about carbon taxes. He talks about things like power plants and our hot water tanks being stranded assets in the future because he wants to switch it all over to wind and solar. He talks about leaving more than 80% of oil and gas in the ground. And this is not something I'm digging up from him from the 80s. Like, he just published this thing just after the lockdowns. And so I'm really hoping that some of those journalists who are there standing in front of him in the parliamentary press gallery stick a mic in his face and get him to answer these questions.
It's also, the entire thing is just so staged that it almost feels like we're living out an Orwell novel, because we were told on January 6th that Justin Trudeau was resigning because of internal conflicts in the party, and that he just couldn't manage being prime minister with these fractures, right? Presumably talking about Chrystia Freeland, exactly what you were saying, that he was trying to kick her out. She said it in interviews, that he said, come deliver the fall economic update, and then I'm going to fire you the next day, and I'm going to replace you with Mark Carney, right? And she said,
not
I'm not going
great
to do
people
that.
management. That's just
Yeah.
not good people management.
Yeah, I'm going to pull the plug. And it's funny that you said, fiscal restraint in this government is, I'm only willing to do $40 billion in deficits, not 60. 60 is too far, but 40, I'm okay with that. And then they turn around and they say, oh, look, 85% of our members support Mark Carney. Pay no attention to the 60% that mysteriously vanished and didn't get a chance to vote. And then to your point that this is just the same government, Mark Carney announced yesterday that he had appointed Marco Mendicino as his chief of staff. Of course, Marco Mendicino was Justin Trudeau's immigration minister, among many other positions that he held. So same crew, same people, same insiders. I want to go to this photo because I mentioned this on our live stream the other night, that if you had asked me at any point in the last 9 years how I would be feeling and what I would be saying the night that Justin Trudeau got removed from office, like his last day at Prime Minister, I would have assumed that I would be in good spirits and optimistic and happy about the future of Canada. And yet I feel the exact opposite. I feel like filled with dread and just worrying about the future of our country. Justin Trudeau on his way out is sort of making a mockery of all Canadians, as he tends to do. This is a great photo that you actually sent to me that was taken by a Reuters photographer of Justin Trudeau carrying a chair out, his own chair, out of the House of Commons. I guess this is one of the traditions of our parliamentary system or our Westminster democracy. And I don't know if we can zoom in on that face, Sean, but Justin Trudeau, always the entertainer, always the jester, elect a clown, get a circus, sticking his tongue out. What do you make of this as the image of Canada's democracy in our Westminster system?
Well, it's truly an iconic photo, and kudos to Carlos Osorio, who snapped that photo, like you said, for Reuters. Just even if I remove, my feelings about it, if you look at it again, the photographer uses, there are these tiny little windows up in the upstairs hallway looking down into the House of Commons, and the photographer uses the window frame to
Sean,
frame.
why don't you put the photo back up on the screen here?
It's really quite something if you look at it. Like, if we still had look at this. If we still had printed history books or encyclopedias, this would be in one of them. Because you look at the artistry where the photographer is using the natural window frame. His foot is still in the air, so it's an action shot. It's just an outstanding photo. Now, if you look at the subject matter, you're right. I was doing a little contest on my own social media saying, what should we name this? Of the budget will balance itself, or I doubled the national debt. I thought maybe the Miley Cyrus song, I came in like a wrecking ball, might be more suitable because his tongue is hanging out. And this is just fiscal issues. Again, like, I'm not exaggerating. That man's government did double the national debt. That is the same guy who kept on cranking up carbon taxes on us. And when reporters dared ask him about it, he simply said, well, the only people that really feel the cost of the carbon tax, Candice, are people in gigantic mansions with an indoor swimming pool and 3 big personal cars. You could not have said, let them eat cake louder. And so this guy's record is a disaster, an absolute fiscal dumpster fire. And I know other issues are with that gentleman and that there's other people that are upset with him about other issues. But from a fiscal standpoint, just an absolute disaster. And so, yeah, that photo tells.
1,000 words, doesn't it? I want to move on to talk about the latest with regards to our American neighbors. And I thought a good segue to this was to go back to Sunday night and see a clip of our former Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, who I have a lot of time for these days. I think that he's much more sensible than the run-of-the-mill liberal. But I thought this joke was absolutely just such poor taste and really, again, pouring gasoline on the fire. So here is a clip of former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien joking about burning down the White House. Let's play that clip.
During the War of 1812, Americans came to what is known Canada on a mission of conquest. They were defeated by Colonel de Salaberry in what is now Quebec, and by leaders like the great Indigenous chief Tecumseh, and I don't know, apparently some burned the White House at that time. But I'm too old to do it.
But I'm told to do it. So some say someone burned the White House back then. Sure, that is true. During the War of 1812, that happens, a historical fact. In fact, the American national anthem is written by someone who observed this. And that is what he's talking about, the rockets, red glare, the bombs bursting in air. That was the British, the Canadians, engaging in a war. Is that really the best thing to mention and to joke about? Again, you could hear the auditorium burst in applause when he said that we burned the White House down, and then kind of saying, they told me to do it, like told you to do it to say it, or told you to do it again, like burn the White House down again. Part of it is a language barrier, perhaps. But given the backdrop of President Trump and the back and forth that we're having, we're still in the middle of a tit for tat with war. With a trade war. I want to just quickly, Sam, Kris, before I get your reaction, just the latest is that Premier Ford in Ontario said that Ontario will slap the 25% levy on U.S.-bound electricity. So he's going to go through with that, even though we had heard that President Trump was pausing most of the tariffs due to the NAFTA or the USMCA agreement. And in response, President Trump on Monday was quite angry about it. So I want to read a Truth Social post that he put up. He said, despite the fact that Canada is charging the US from 250 to 390% tariffs on many of our farm products, Ontario just announced a 25% surcharge on electricity of all things, and you're not even allowed to do that. Because our tariffs are reciprocal, we'll just get it all back on April 2nd. Canada is a tariff abuser and always has been, but the United States is not going to be subsidizing Canada any longer. We don't need your cars, we don't need your lumber, we don't need your energy, and very soon you will find out Make America Great Again with 3 exclamation points. So it seems to me that Doug Ford is just making everything worse. And again, those clips of people like Jean Chrétien, they circulate. The Americans see them. They know that Canadians are mocking them and joking about burning down their White House at the convention where they're naming the new prime minister. I mean, it's not a good look. What do you think?
Not a great look. And years in radio and of listening to former Prime Minister Chrétien, I think what he said was, I'm too old to do it, not told to do it.
Oh.
So maybe even a little bit more gasoline dumped on the fire. Like, I'm too old to do it now.
You guys go do it. Yeah.
So I'll just take off my CTF hat for a second here. In more of a radio host mode, I've interviewed probably thousands of people from literally every place, like a prime minister and people literally locked in prison. You really need to kind of de-escalate a situation when they're trying to get a point across, or you're trying to truly be heard or have someone else feel they're being heard. So usually the rule is de-escalate, find common ground, and work towards a solution. Those 3 things work well in most arguments. This just seems to be dumping more gas on it. And the sad thing is that it's always the normal working people, Candice, that bear the brunt of this. There's a famous picture of a chessboard where it shows pawns and knights and rooks all lying down bloodied on the battlefield of ideas, or an actual battlefield. And the king and queen of both sets, the black and the white, are over on the side having dinner. Right. And it just always feels like it's the average working person, the small business person, the beef farmer, that person, the oil patch worker that is going to get kicked over this sort of stuff. Now, as far as whether or not to slap, extra export tariffs on power, I don't know. I'm of 2 minds of that, because I recently heard, listening to our former colleague, Brian Lilly, talk about this. And he's our former Sun News colleague. And he talked about this on some podcasts on Sunday, probably on yours as well, where he pointed out that that's the only thing that really got a lot of attention in the States, of like, hey, I'm going to make your power cost more. Smarten up. Is that wise? I don't know. It's a really great question. What I'm worried about is that if we do reciprocal tit for tat tariffs, so to speak, all that is a tax on imports. It's just a tax. It just means that we're tying our own shoelaces together and punching ourselves in the face before we get into a fight with somebody who's much stronger and much bigger than us. And I'm really worried that it's going to be oil and gas workers here in Alberta, that it's eventually going to be a farmer or a producer across the prairie, that it's going to be that auto worker in Ontario that's going to be out of a job. And that's a real thing. That's just not a tally on a spreadsheet. That is someone's home. That is someone's ability to buy food for their kids. And so I really am hoping that some of these leaders kind of pull some of the lemon out of this and really work on getting a deal. Like, for example, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has been down there pleading and doing a charm offensive and really trying to engage with these folks, including US President Donald Trump. She went to Mar-a-Lago. She's trying to deal directly with governors saying, hi, do you really want 35 cents more per gallon for gasoline? Because that's what's going to happen. That's smart. And last I heard, she's actually heading down to Florida. She's going to be speaking with the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro, and the whole lot of them. That's good because Trump listens to that media. That's like going on Fox News on a bit of steroids. So it's smart to get that message out there. I'm concerned, though, if they just keep heaping heated rhetoric on up here, that it's just going to make the bear angrier.
Well, to stick with Danielle Smith, I mean, it's interesting because Premier Doug Ford sort of seems like a bull in a china shop. Like sometimes I see him going on Fox News and he's making a really compelling case, say like, let's build a better relationship. He calls it Can-Am. Let's like further integrate our markets and have more freedom. And that's great. That's good Ford. And then there's the other side, which is like, okay, let's thump our chest and we're going to really make you hurt Americans. And the reality is that they are a much bigger market. They can make us hurt a lot more. And so to bring it back to Danielle Smith, we had Premier Ford yesterday at a press conference calling on Premier Danielle Smith of Alberta to add an export tax on Alberta oil. So he wants Danielle Smith and the province of Alberta to follow their path by taxing natural resources. Let's play that clip.
We have to remember the 4.3 million barrels of oil that's coming from Alberta. As Premier Smith said on her comments, I think over the last couple of days, she has the Trump card. Well, a message to Premier Smith, one day I think you might have to use that Trump card and give approval for an export tax. Because you want to talk about a Trump card, that will instantly change the game.
Instantly change the game. Well, Smith, to her credit, basically instantly shot this down. So writing on X and responding to Premier Ford, she said, let me be clear, Alberta will never agree to such an absurd and self-destructive idea, among other things. Now, not only would it be self-destructive for Alberta in an era where the federal government has done everything it can, Kris, to hit Alberta, to prevent Alberta from reaching its true potential and landlocking its oil. But also, Ontario gets its oil via a pipeline that goes through the United States. So just on its face, this is so absurd for the Premier of Ontario to be telling the Premier of Alberta to put a tax on oil when that is the oil that goes through the United States and back up through Line 9 up into Sarnia and across Ontario. It's so absurd. Good for Danielle Smith to knock that one down. What do you think?
Yeah, there's as an Albertan and as somebody who keeps an eye on how much money the energy sector pulls in here, the oil patch pulls in here, when he says things like that, like it makes my scalp crawl. Like, no, you cannot do that. And it's good to look at kind of the economy of scale here and what we're talking about. So if Ford, for example, is trying to put some pressure on the administration in the White House through, say, the auto sector, talking around that issue is smart because we know that auto sector between Michigan and Ontario is so integrated that a vehicle from start to finish with all of its components and parts might have crossed that Windsor Bridge like 15 times. It's basically the same organism, the auto sector, back, forth. So Ford would be wise to try to help hammer out a new deal with Trump using the auto sector kind of as a vehicle, pardon my metaphor. So, but it's a smaller portion of the Ontario economy than, say, the oil patch. Oil and gas is here for Alberta. And exactly to your point, thanks to the federal government dragging its feet and strangling our resource projects and our pipelines, Alberta really has only one customer. Yes, we have one pipeline that goes out to the West Coast, but we don't have the international market access to be able to say, oh, that's fine, we'll just sell elsewhere. No, we've been told we can't do that for the past 10 years, and that is why we sell at a discount down to the United States. Now, there are some intricacies there where there are some refineries, especially in the northern United States, that have adapted to our form of oil sands, bitumen. They would have to retool a bit if they were suddenly trying to find other markets. But frankly, they get oil from other places too. It would be easier for the Americans to decide to get oil from other places too if we started messing around, heaven forbid, with an export tax on our energy. And so that's why you see Danielle Smith saying, like, hell will freeze over before that happens. And that is definitely the smart thing for her to say.
Kris Sims, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Great to see you today, and thanks for your time.
Thanks, Candice.
That was a clip from my daily show, The Candice Malcolm Show, where we discuss news, politics, and culture from a uniquely Canadian and common sense perspective. To catch full episodes, we record them and air them every day at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Head on over to our website, junonews.com.